Welcome, everyone. Ready for another deep dive into history? Today, we're heading back to early 20th century India to explore a really fascinating movement, the Khilafat movement.
Oh, this is going to be interesting.
It is. So whether you're new to the UPSC exams and want to, really understand this part of modern Indian history, or you just love history, this one is for you.
Perfect.
This deep dive is going to help make those connections between the Khilafat movement and Indian nationalism super clear.
Right.
And if you're enjoying it, please hit that like button and subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode.
Definitely.
All right, let's set the scene a little bit, okay?
Okay.
Imagine India right after World War I.
Okay.
Tensions are high, there's so much resentment towards British rule, and it's like everything is about to boil over.
Yeah, World War I really had a huge impact on India. It wasn't just some far-off conflict. It really hit India hard. The war really drained India's resources, and that led to, prices skyrocketing and factories closing. It was tough, widespread hardship, really. And obviously, that just added fuel to the fire, this existing discontent and anti-British feeling.
Well, for sure. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire that's already burning.
Exactly.
And then, to make things even worse, you have three major events that happen.
Oh, yeah.
Each one just pushing things closer to the edge.
Yeah.
The Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Revolt Act, and then the treatment of the Turkish Khalifa.
Right, the spiritual leader for Muslims around the world.
Yeah.
Huge impact.
Massive. And each of these events really had a deep psychological impact on the people of India.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So first, can you talk about Jallianwala Bagh? When British troops fired on those unarmed civilians, it's just horrific.
Absolutely. It was a horrifying act of violence, and it really left a scar on the Indian psyche. It really exposed the brutality of colonial rule, I think, for a lot of people.
Definitely. It was a real turning point.
Yeah.
And then you have the Revolt Act, which allowed imprisonment without even a trial. Talk about fanning the flames of fear and oppression.
Yeah, people were already scared, and then you bring in a law like that.
Yeah.
That just eroded any trust that might have been left in the British government. It was seen as a direct attack on civil liberties, basic human rights.
Totally. It was just asking for rebellion.
Yeah.
And then you also have the treatment of the Turkish Khalifa.
Right.
Can you explain why that resonated so deeply with India's Muslim population?
So to understand that, we have to remember that the Ottoman Empire, which the Khalifa was the head of, was seen as the symbol of Islamic unity and power, right?
Okay. And so,
Indian Muslims, they felt this really strong sense of solidarity with the Khalifa. So when his position weakened, they saw it as an affront to Islam itself.
okay, that makes sense. It's not just about religion then, it's also about their identity.
Exactly. It was about feeling threatened, like their identity was being threatened. And that's really where the Khilafat movement comes in. It wasn't just about what was happening in Turkey. It was the result of years of frustration with British rule, economic hardship, political oppression, and this wounded sense of religious identity.
Right, it all just built up.
Exactly, like a perfect storm. All these factors came together to create this mass movement.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics now. What exactly was the Khilafat movement, and what were its main goals?
So at its core, the Khilafat movement was a pan-Islamic movement that came about in response to the weakening of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. Their main goal. They wanted to protect the Khalifa's position and make sure he kept his authority over Muslim holy sites.
And this was so important to Indian Muslims because
they saw the Khalifa as the symbolic leader of the global Muslim community. If his authority was threatened, they saw it as a threat to Islam itself. Remember, for centuries, the Ottoman Sultan had held the title of Khalifa, and for Muslims worldwide, that was a source of unity and pride.
Right.
So when the Treaty of Sevres came along, the one that imposed those really harsh terms on the defeated Ottoman Empire, it was like a direct attack on the Khalifa's authority, and it was humiliating for Muslims globally.
So you have this event happening outside of India, the Treaty of Sevres, that ends up triggering this powerful reaction within India.
Yeah.
What specifically about the treaty sparked so much outrage among Indian Muslims?
Well, the treaty basically dismantled the Ottoman Empire.
Wow.
And it included these provisions that stripped the Khalifa of his power, took away a lot of his territory, and even threatened his control over Mecca and Medina, the holy cities.
Oh, wow.
For Muslims, that was a blatant violation of Islamic principles and a direct attack on the Khalifa's spiritual authority.
It's like adding insult to injury and on top of everything else that was going on in India. And this is where things start to get really interesting. because this is where religious identity and national identity start to converge. How did the Khilafat movement become intertwined with the broader Indian nationalist movement?
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Enter Mahatma Gandhi. He saw the Khilafat movement as this incredible opportunity, a chance to unite Hindus and Muslims under a common cause.
Gandhi was such a brilliant strategist.
Yeah.
He really saw the potential of this movement to really boost the struggle for independence.
Oh, absolutely. He was a master strategist.
Yeah.
He recognized that shared resentment towards British rule, that could be a powerful force. He thought, if we can bridge the religious divide between Hindus and Muslims, it could create this united front against colonial power.
So it was like Gandhi took the existing energy of the Khilafat movement and then he channeled it towards this bigger goal of Indian independence.
Exactly. That's exactly it. But his approach, it wasn't immediate, you know?
Yeah.
He didn't jump in all at once. He was initially more moderate, focusing on things like peaceful protests, petitions to the British government.
Right.
But then events like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, they really shook him, and it pushed him to be more active and confrontational.
Yeah.
You know, it was like he had to change his strategy.
And that was the turning point.
Yeah, you could say that. By May 1920, Gandhi had become a big figure in the All India Khilafat Committee, and he started advocating for a more assertive strategy: non-cooperation.
Non-cooperation. Now, this is a really important concept, especially for anyone trying to understand the Indian independence movement.
Yeah.
So what did this program of non-cooperation actually involve?
The non-cooperation movement, it was officially launched at this big meeting in Allahabad, June 1920. It was a multifaceted strategy. They wanted to basically paralyze the British administration in India.
Wow, so it wasn't just protests and demonstrations.
No, it was much more than that. It was about strategically withdrawing cooperation from the British Raj. So they called for people to boycott British titles, refuse to serve in the civil services, the army, the police, and ultimately they even called for refusing to pay taxes.
Yeah.
It was a huge escalation in the Indian independence movement. It was a real shift from those moderate appeals to a more defiant stance against British rule.
That's a big change.
Yeah, it was. And this is where you see how brilliant Gandhi's strategy was, because by aligning the Khilafat movement with this non-cooperation movement, he managed to mobilize not just Muslims, but a lot of Hindus too.
Wow.
He created this truly national movement that could actually challenge the very foundation of British rule.
It's amazing how this movement that started with this specific religious concern grew to encompass this broader nationalistic agenda, this unity, this coming together of Hindus and Muslims for a common cause. It's just remarkable.
It really is.
And it makes the Khilafat movement such an important part of understanding the whole Indian independence movement.
Absolutely. It really is. It was a remarkable moment in Indian history. But,
Yeah.
you know, it's important to remember that this unity, it wasn't, you know, without its complexities. We should really look at the dynamics of this alliance a bit closer.
Okay, let's do that. What were some of those, nuances in this Hindu-Muslim unity, and how did that play out in the broader political landscape?
Well, the Congress at the time, it wasn't, this one big united group. There were a lot of different opinions within the party about the Khilafat movement, about how closely Congress should align itself with a movement that was, rooted in Islamic principles.
So it wasn't just this simple, straightforward thing of all Hindus and Muslims coming together, without any disagreements or debates.
Right, exactly. Some Congress leaders, they were hesitant. They didn't want to align with a pan-Islamic movement. They were worried it would alienate some Hindus,
Yeah.
And they were concerned about communal tensions. I mean, this was a sensitive issue, the Turkish Khalifa, and it had big implications for Indian politics.
We have to remember the context, right?
Why?
This was a time when communalism was already starting to grow, so anything that could make those tensions worse had to be approached very carefully.
Exactly. But then, you also had some really prominent Congress leaders, including Gandhi, who saw the Khilafat movement as this amazing opportunity. It was a chance to create a united front against British rule. They believed that the struggle against colonialism, that was bigger than religious differences,
Right.
that a united front was absolutely necessary to achieve independence.
So you had these two perspectives within Congress trying to navigate these really complicated issues of religious and national identity. What about the Muslim League?
Yes.
How did the main political organization representing Indian Muslims, how did they view this alliance?
Well, their stance is really interesting. At first, the Muslim League wasn't so keen on aligning with the Congress,
Yeah.
which was, predominantly Hindu. But the Khilafat issue, it was a real turning point.
So that shared concern for the Turkish Caliphate, it brought them closer to Congress.
Exactly. The Muslim League saw the Khilafat movement as an opportunity. It was a chance for them to, really exert their influence on the national stage and secure more political rights for Muslims within a future independent India. They realized how powerful a united front could be, and they decided to support the Congress, including the non-cooperation movement.
This alliance, it was temporary, but it was a huge moment in Indian nationalism.
It was.
It showed that it was possible for Hindus and Muslims to come together against colonial rule. It showed that it was possible to put those religious differences aside. But ultimately, the Khilafat movement didn't achieve its main goal of protecting the Khalifa.
That's right. Things happening outside of India played a big part in what happened to the Khilafat movement. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, he was a nationalist leader. He became really prominent, and he started making all these reforms. And eventually, that led to the abolition of the Caliphate in 1924.
Wow, so the very institution that the Khilafat movement was trying to protect was dismantled.
Yeah.
What a turn of events.
It really was. And this basically took away the foundation of the Khilafat movement. Without the Caliphate, they lost their central driving force.
Right.
The movement lost its momentum, and it just kind of fizzled out.
What a tragic end to a movement that had brought so much hope and unity. But even though it didn't reach its main goal, it left a big impact, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The legacy of the Khilafat movement is complicated.
Okay.
It has a lot of sides to it. But even though that immediate objective that failed, the movement had a lasting effect on Indian nationalism and the politics of the subcontinent.
So let's talk about that legacy. What were some of the main things that came out of the Khilafat movement? And how did it affect the fight for independence later on?
Well, one of the biggest impacts was how it politically awakened the Muslim population in India. You see, before the Khilafat movement, a lot of Indian Muslims, they weren't really involved in the nationalist movement.
They were more focused on their religious identity.
Yeah.
Right. And didn't really see themselves as part of the struggle for independence.
Exactly. But the Khilafat movement, it emphasized protecting the Khalifa. He was a symbol of Islamic unity, and that really energized Indian Muslims. It brought them into the fold of Indian nationalism. It gave them a way to express their political hopes,
I see.
and to join with Hindus in this fight against British rule.
It was like the Khilafat movement created this bridge connecting their religious identity as Muslims to their national identity as Indians.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. And this new political awareness among Muslims, it changed the demographics of the nationalist movement. It brought in urban Muslims,
Okay.
a group that had been kind of, detached from the independence struggle.
So it made the nationalist movement bigger, more representative of all the different religious groups in India.
Exactly. And this is really important, especially for UPSC aspirants. The Khilafat movement, it was a catalyst. It transformed the nationalist movement.
So
It went from being led by a small elite to a much larger mass movement. It brought Muslims in, especially urban Muslims, and it gave the movement this new energy. And you can see this in the widespread support for the non-cooperation movement.
that's fascinating. So the Khilafat movement, even though it didn't achieve its main objective, it ended up strengthening and expanding the Indian nationalist movement.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about Muslims either.
Right.
The Khilafat movement, along with the non-cooperation movement, really helped to politicize a lot of different groups in Indian society.
You're talking about women, traders, students, peasants, everyone joining the movement.
Exactly, everyone.
Okay.
The Khilafat movement created this feeling of shared purpose, of solidarity. It cut across religious and social divides. It energized people, inspired them to get involved in the fight for independence. And women, they started to play a much bigger role in the political sphere.
Really?
Yeah, they organized protests, they mobilized support, they even led demonstrations.
So the Khilafat movement, even though it came from a religious context, it ended up impacting all these different parts of Indian society. It just goes to show how complex and interconnected these social and political movements really are.
Absolutely. And it's important to understand these nuances, how everything is connected, to really get the significance of the Khilafat movement in shaping Indian nationalism. But beyond these immediate impacts, the Khilafat movement also had these long-term consequences. They're really important for understanding what happened in the decades leading up to independence and partition.
This brings up an important question. What happened to this incredible Hindu-Muslim unity that came out of the Khilafat movement? Did it last or did it fall apart?
Well, this is where things get a bit, somber. The Khilafat movement did bring Hindus and Muslims together, that's true. But that unity, it was fragile.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
didn't last. When the caliphate was abolished in Turkey, the movement lost its steam, and the alliance between Hindus and Muslims started to weaken.
Like the glue holding them together had dissolved.
Exactly, exactly. And so, old divisions started to reappear. Communal tensions that had been pushed down during the Khilafat movement, they started to resurface. Religious identities became more important again, and they overshadowed that shared national identity that they'd worked so hard to build.
So the movement that had shown the potential for Hindu-Muslim unity,
Yeah.
in a way, it ended up contributing to the rise of those very tensions that would lead to partition.
It's one of those ironies of history. The Khilafat movement, it had such good intentions, and it was initially successful in creating that united front against colonialism. But in the end, it unintentionally planted the seeds of discord and division, and that would have long-lasting consequences.
It's a reminder that even movements with the best of intentions can have unintended consequences. And it shows that when unity is built on a shaky foundation, it can easily fall apart. But before we get into what happened with this fractured unity and its effect on the lead up to partition, let's take a moment to look back at what we've talked about so far.
We've really gone through a fascinating chapter of Indian history, haven't we? We've seen the Khilafat movement rise and fall, the amazing unity it created, and then the sad return of those communal tensions. What are your biggest takeaways from this period? What can we learn from the Khilafat movement, especially when we think about how hard it is to build a unified and inclusive nation?
I think it's really important to understand that even though the Khilafat movement didn't achieve its main goal, it really showed us that it is possible to bring different groups of people together, even if they have different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And that's powerful. It shows us that religion, which we often think of as something that divides people, it can actually bring people together and motivate them to act. It challenges that idea that you can't have both religious and national identities.
Exactly, yeah. But it also reminds us that if unity is only built on something temporary, especially something external, it's not going to last.
Right.
The Khilafat movement started to decline after the caliphate was abolished in Turkey, and that just shows how easily unity can fall apart when it's based on something that's outside of your control.
It's a good reminder that for unity to really work, it has to come from a deeper place, from something inside,
Yeah.
something that goes beyond specific events or situations.
Exactly. And this is something that's so important for anyone who's studying modern Indian history, especially for UPSC aspirants. The Khilafat movement, even though it didn't succeed in the end, it really left its mark on Indian politics.
It changed how the independence movement would unfold.
Absolutely. One of the biggest things it did was raise political awareness among Muslims in India. The movement brought them into the fight for independence, gave them a voice, gave them a platform to demand a fair and just society.
It's like the movement empowered them politically. They hadn't really been part of the mainstream nationalist conversation before that.
Exactly. And this increased political participation from Muslims, well, it had a big impact on the Indian National Congress. At first, they were a bit hesitant about the Khilafat movement, remember?
Right.
But they started to realize that it was really important to include Muslim concerns and goals in their own plans for independence.
Our Congress had to adapt.
They did. They had to change and grow to fit this new political landscape. The Khilafat movement really pushed the Congress to think about how religious identity fit into the fight for independence and how they could represent a diverse population with different, sometimes conflicting interests.
It must have been a real learning curve for them.
It was. It was a time of figuring things out, of compromise, as they tried to build a movement that included everyone. And this process of negotiating and adapting, it continued in the decades leading up to independence and partition. The things they learned during the Khilafat movement, both the good and the bad about Hindu-Muslim unity, it shaped how different political groups acted during those years.
It's like the Khilafat movement had this lasting effect. It influenced the conversations people were having and the events that would ultimately decide what would happen to the subcontinent.
Exactly. And that's why it's such an important part of history to understand, especially for UPSC aspirants. If you want to understand India's fight for independence and the things that led to the creation of Pakistan, you have to understand the Khilafat movement, the good, the bad, and its lasting effects.
So what we've done today isn't just, some dry history lesson.
Right.
It's really a look at how identity, unity, and division, how these things work, and how they still affect our world. The Khilafat movement, it might be a chapter from the past, but it shows us the challenges of building a nation, the complexities of balancing religious and national identities, and how important it is to learn from history so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
Right. It emphasizes that history isn't just a bunch of dates and events. It's about people's experiences, their hopes, their struggles. It's about learning from those things to deal with the present and make a better future.
Before we go, I want to leave everyone with something to think about. We talked about how the Khilafat movement, even with good intentions, couldn't stop the rise of communal tension and the eventual partition of India. So the question is, what can we learn from that? What can we do to build a society where unity is stronger than those religious and other dividing lines? How do we make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes? It's a big question, and it challenges us to be more aware, to really think about how we can create a fair and more inclusive world.
It's a call to action. It's saying, hey, learn from history, embrace our differences, and work towards a unity that's built on respect and understanding. Let's make sure the things that divided us in the past don't limit us today. And remember, exploring history is a journey. Keep learning about the Khilafat movement, look at it from different perspectives, understand the context, and come to your own conclusions.
And if you found this deep dive interesting, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel for more, and click that notification bell so you don't miss our future deep dives. We'll see you next time.